All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. You sent this paper my way, and knowing how deep you are in the world of language modeling, I figured this one must be pretty interesting. It's called block diffusion, interpolating between autoregressive and diffusion language models. And well, the title alone kind of hints that we're going to be getting into some core challenges in how these models actually generate text.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, diffusion models, they've shown some really exciting results in generative tasks, like for image generation, for example, but they haven't quite reached the same level of success when it comes to language modeling. So this paper, is really tackling that kind of gap, trying to bridge it by kind of borrowing some of the best ideas from more traditional autoregressive models.
Right. So for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with this area of research or just need a quick recap, what exactly are these block diffusion language models? What's the core idea here?
Sure. So the basic idea is that these models generate text, not word by word and not all at once either, but kind of block by block, so in chunks, And within each of these blocks, they use a process called discrete denoising diffusion. But here's the key part. The generation of each block is conditioned on the blocks that came before it, just like in an autoregressive model. So it's sort of like building a wall brick by brick, but with each brick, you're also kind of chiseling away at the details, refining it.
I see. So it's kind of combining the two approaches, right? Taking that sequential aspect of autoregressive models, but then using diffusion within each of those steps, those blocks. And why is that? How does that help us get past some of those limitations that you were talking about?
Right. So by generating text in these blocks, sequentially building upon what came before, they can naturally handle text of any length, right? That's a big hurdle that a lot of diffusion models have had trouble with. They're often limited to fixed length sequences, but this way they can generate text of any length, really. And then the other thing is, by using this block by block approach, it actually allows them to leverage what's called KV caching, which is a really powerful optimization technique that's commonly used in transformer models. It essentially lets them remember information from previous computations, which really speeds things up, makes the inference process much more efficient. And then, finally, by incorporating diffusion within each block, they're aiming to produce text that's of a higher quality than what we've typically seen from standard diffusion models.
Gotcha. So it's about taking advantage of the best of both worlds, the efficiency and quality of autoregressive models, but then also the potential parallelism and the flexibility of diffusion models.
Yeah, exactly.
So this figure one that you mentioned that provides a kind of visual comparison of the three approaches.
Yeah.
How does it actually show that block diffusion is kind of hitting that sweet spot?
Yeah, so if you look at figure one, it kind of lays out the steps involved in generating text with each approach, and you can really see how block diffusion kind of combines the sequential aspect of autoregressive models with the parallel processing that's possible within each block, thanks to diffusion. And you can also see how it allows for KV caching, which is that optimization technique we talked about, and how it can support sequences of any length. So, visually, it really highlights how block diffusion is trying to find that optimal balance between, high quality text generation, efficient processing, and then also, that flexibility to generate sequences of any length.
Okay, so they've got this really interesting concept, but I imagine putting it into practice, actually implementing it and getting it to work, must come with some pretty significant technical hurdles. What were some of the biggest challenges they had to overcome?
Yeah, so one of the main challenges they ran into was figuring out how to actually train these models efficiently, right? Because, if you think about it, a standard single forward pass through the network, that wasn't going to cut it for block diffusion.
Yeah.
So they had to come up with a new training algorithm. And what they ended up doing was creating this two-pass training process.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. What happens in each of those passes?
Right. So in the first pass, what they do is they take the entire input sequence, right, and they pre-compute these key and value caches, which are, it's basically like creating a memory bank of the pass tokens, right? And then in the second pass, what they can do is they can actually compute the denoised predictions for for all the blocks, simultaneously. And because they've already calculated and stored those KV caches from the original clean sequence, they can use that information to condition the diffusion process that's happening within each block, on what came before it. So it's like having a blueprint, of the context readily available.
Interesting. So it's almost like they're doing a dry run, in that first pass to get all that information ready.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then they can actually do the real processing in the second pass.
Precisely.
But they also mentioned this idea of vectorized training, which sounds like it makes things even more efficient. Can you explain how that works?
Right. So vectorized training is basically a way to further optimize that training process, right? And what they do is they actually combine the clean data with a noisy version of that same data. And in that noisy version, each block has a different amount of noise applied to it. And then they feed this combined input, the clean and the noisy, they feed it into the transformer in a single forward pass. So instead of having those two separate passes, they're kind of doing it all at once. And the key to making this work is a special attention mask that they design.
Okay, so this mask, what does it actually do? How does it help with this process?
Yeah, so the attention mask, it basically controls how different parts of the input can, see each other during the attention mechanism, right? And specifically what it does is it allows those noisy tokens within a block. It lets them attend to each other, which helps them kind of, collaboratively denoise. But more importantly, it also lets them attend to all the clean tokens in the blocks that came before. And if you look at figure 3 in the paper, they actually have a really nice visual representation of how this mask works. And this is also, it's related to this concept of flex attention, which they talk about in the supplementary material, which is another way to make those attention kernels, those computations even more efficient. And so by using this vectorized approach, they were able to achieve a pretty significant speed up in training, something like 20 to 25% faster.
Wow.
Yeah.
20 to 25%. That's a huge improvement.
Yeah.
So another challenge that they highlighted was this issue of gradient variance. And I think this is a concept that might not be familiar to all of our listeners. So can you explain what that means in this context and why it's a problem specifically for diffusion models, even when you're working with these blocks?
Right. Yeah. So gradient variance, it basically refers to how much the gradients, which are the signals that guide the model's learning during training, how much those gradients fluctuate, from one training step to the next. And so if you have high variance, that can make the training process really unstable. It can make it converge very slowly or even prevent it from converging to a good solution. And what they found was that even when they reduced the block size down to just a single token, which theoretically should make block diffusion, functionally very similar to standard autoregressive training, they still found that diffusion models tend to have this higher gradient variance.
Okay, so why is that happening? Why are we seeing this higher variance in the diffusion setting?
Right. So the explanation for that really comes down to how diffusion with masking works. So typically in a masked diffusion setup for language, the model is only trying to predict, the unmasked tokens at any given step. So unlike an autoregressive model, which is always predicting the very next token in the sequence, the diffusion model is kind of learning from a more sparse set of explicit targets in each training iteration, and that can lead to more variability in the gradients, which makes the learning process less stable.
I see. So it's almost like the diffusion model is having to fill in more gaps. It's got less information to work with at each step.
Right. Exactly.
So how do they address this gradient variance issue? They must have come up with some ways to mitigate it.
Right. So they actually came up with two really interesting solutions to this problem. The first one is to use these custom what they call clicked noise schedules.
Okay.
So in a masked diffusion process, you're progressively masking out tokens over a series of diffusion steps. And the noise schedule basically dictates, how quickly or slowly that masking happens. And so instead of using, a standard linear schedule, they experimented with schedules where the mask rates are sampled from a uniform distribution within a specific range. So there's a lower bound beta and an upper bound omega. And the idea here is basically to avoid those extremes of masking, right? Because if you have too little masking, that doesn't provide a very strong learning signal. But if you have too much masking, then the prediction test becomes kind of trivial, right? You're just predicting the mask token all the time. And those extreme masking levels, they can lead to those high variance gradients.
Interesting. So by kind of restricting, clipping the range of possible masking probabilities, they're essentially trying to keep the model's learning focused on that sweet spot where the noise is actually informative.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And then the second solution they proposed was to actually optimize that clipping range during training. So instead of just manually selecting those beta and omega values, they try to find the range that actually minimizes the variance of their diffusion training objective, which is the negative evidence lower bound or the NLEBO. And they actually found a really, really clear correlation between the variance of that estimator and the final performance of the model as measured by perplexity on held out data. And interestingly, they also found that the optimal clipping range actually seems to depend on the size of the blocks that you're using.
So the amount of noise that's optimal for learning actually varies depending on how much context the model has to work with.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense, right? I mean, if you're trying to reconstruct a small block of just a few tokens, that's going to be a very different task than trying to reconstruct a larger block with more context.
Absolutely. Now, they also mentioned this term masked BD3LMs. Is that just a different name for the same thing, or is that a specific type of block diffusion model?
Yeah, so masked BD3LMs actually refers to a specific type of block diffusion that uses a masking noise process. So masking, where you randomly replace tokens with a special mask token. That's a very, very common and effective noise strategy that's used in discrete diffusion models for language. And they actually go into, the mathematical formulation of this per token noise process in the paper. You can find it in equation 12 and the subsequent definitions of Q key and key S. But essentially what's happening is that at each step of the diffusion process, you have this probability of replacing any given token within a block with this mask token.
Okay, and for this masked version, they were able to derive a simpler training objective.
Right, yeah. So by drawing on some prior work in mask diffusion language modeling, they were able to derive this simplified training objective, which is presented in equations 8 and 19. And what's really interesting about this objective is that it actually bears a really strong resemblance to the standard cross-entropy lice that's used in autoregressive language modeling. And theoretically, this objective is actually invariant to the choice of the noise schedule.
Wow. That's really interesting, especially given what we were just talking about, with the importance of carefully choosing those noise schedule.
Right, exactly. And this actually highlights a really important point about the difference between, the theoretical properties of these models and their practical behavior. So while the theoretical invariance holds for the exact ELBO, the estimators that we use to approximate it during training, those are actually influenced by the choice of the noise schedule. And as a result, so are the gradients that we compute. And they actually do a really, really cool experiment in the paper to demonstrate this. They set the block size to just one token.
Okay.
So L prime equals 1. And in this setting, theoretically their block diffusion model should be functionally equivalent in expectation to a standard autoregressive model. But what they find is that there's still a measurable gap in perplexity between the two. And they show that this discrepancy is largely due to that higher gradient variance that's inherent in the diffusion training process, even in this single token setting. And if you look at table 1 in the paper, it actually shows how tuning that noise schedule, to a full masking strategy where every token is masked, it actually closes that performance gap, and that really highlights the practical significance of managing that gradient variance, even when the models are theoretically very similar.
Yeah, it's a great example of how those theoretical guarantees don't always translate perfectly into the real world.
Right.
Yeah.
So after all of this work, on the architecture and the training, how did these block diffusion models, these BD3LMs, how did they actually perform on real world language modeling benchmarks?
Yeah, so the results were actually pretty impressive. So in terms of standard likelihood evaluation, which is typically measured by perplexity, they tested their models on two different data sets, LM1B and Open Web Text, and on both of those data sets, they achieved state-of-the-art perplexity among discrete diffusion models. So they were actually significantly better than previous leading methods like MDLM. And if you look at tables 3 and 4 in the paper, they actually show the perplexity scores and the percentage improvements, and the gains are actually quite substantial, which indicates that they're really making a big step forward in terms of how well diffusion models can actually model the probability distribution of natural language.
That's great. And what about zero-shot performance? How well do these models generalize to new situations, to tasks that they haven't specifically been trained on?
Yeah, so they also tested their models on a variety of downstream tasks in a zero-shot setting, and they actually found that BD3LM performs really well. In fact, on the PubMed dataset, it actually outperformed the autoregressive model in terms of perplexity, and on other data sets like Wikitext, LM1B, and AG News, it achieved the best results among diffusion models. So this suggests that BD3LM is learning a really robust and generalizable representation of language, and you can find all of these zero-shot results in table 5 in the paper.
Now, one of the big limitations of many diffusion models for language has been their inability to generate text of varying lengths, right? They've often been limited to generating sequences of a fixed length. So how did BD3LMs address that issue?
Right. Yeah. So this is one of the key advantages of their block-based semi-autoregressive design. Unlike many earlier diffusion models that were restricted to generating, outputs of a predefined length, BD3LMs can actually generate sequences of arbitrary length, and they can even generate sequences that are longer than the context length that they were trained on, and they show this in table 6 in the paper, where they actually compare the generated sequence lengths of their model to other models like SED and traditional autoregressive models, and to prevent the model from generating overly long or nonsensical outputs, they use some practical stopping criteria during sampling. So things like encountering an end of sequence token or detecting a drop in the entropy of the generated text.
Okay, so they've got these mechanisms in place to make sure that the model doesn't just run off the rails.
Right. Yeah.
And start generating infinitely long sequences of gibberish.
Exactly.
But it can still generate text of any length that it needs to. Now, we've been talking a lot about perplexity, which is a quantitative measure of how well the model is doing. But what about the actual quality of the text? How coherent and natural does the text sound to a human?
Right. So to evaluate that, the quality of the generated samples, they use what's called generative perplexity, which is basically you take a large language model, something like GPT-2 large, and you use that to measure the perplexity of the text that's been generated by your model. And the idea is that if the text is coherent and natural, then it should have a lower perplexity according to that large language model. And they found that BD3LMs actually have better generative perplexity than previous diffusion-based text generation methods like SED, MDLM, and SSDLM. And what's really interesting is that they were able to achieve this with significantly fewer generation steps than some of those other methods. So they were actually much more efficient in generating that high quality text. And they also did some qualitative analysis, where they actually looked at the generated text.
And they found that the samples produced by BD3LM were more coherent than those from MDLM, and they actually approached the quality of the text that's generated by autoregressive models.
Wow, so they're really hitting that sweet spot of both quantitative and qualitative performance. And they also did some ablation studies.
Yes.
To try to figure out which components of their approach were really contributing to these gains. So what did they learn from those studies?
Right. Yeah. So one of the things they looked at was the impact of using different noise schedules, and what they found was that those clip noise schedules that we talked about earlier, those were actually much more effective at reducing the training variance and improving the test perplexity than standard linear, logarithmic, square root, square, and cosine schedules. So that really confirmed that their approach to managing the noise was really important, and they also confirmed that the optimal clubbing range for the noise schedule does indeed depend on the block size, which we talked about earlier, and then they also did some ablations on the training algorithm, and that confirmed that their vectorized training method using flex attention, it actually resulted in that 20 to 25% speed up that we mentioned earlier. So all of those ablation studies really kind of validated the key design choices that they made.
That's great. So finally, how do they kind of position their work within the broader context of language modeling research? How does it relate to other efforts in the field?
Yeah, so they actually do a really nice job of discussing that in section 7 of the paper, and they emphasize how BD3LMs build upon that foundational D3PM framework, and how they incorporate advancements from MDLM, but specifically addressing some of the limitations of MDLM in terms of handling fixed sequence lengths and achieving imperative perplexity. They also draw a distinction between their discrete diffusion approach and Gaussian diffusion over word embeddings, which has often struggled to achieve comparable perplexity, and they also differentiate BD3LMs from other semi-autoregressive diffusion models, like SSDLM, for example, and they highlight BD3LM's advantages in terms of tractable likelihood estimation, faster generation speeds, and overall better sample quality. And they also acknowledge the connections to recent advancements in purely autoregressive models and even autoregressive diffusion models. And finally, they do acknowledge some limitations of BD3LMs, like the potentially higher training costs compared to standard diffusion models, and potential constraints on generation speed and controllability when using very small block sizes.
So really, for our listeners who are out there, deep in the trenches of AI research and ML engineering, what does this all mean? Block diffusion seems like it's a pretty significant advancement.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. I mean, especially for those who are working with diffusion-based approaches, this idea of being able to generate longer, higher quality text, more efficiently, and also improving that fundamental likelihood modeling capability of diffusion models for language. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it's really about pushing the boundaries of what diffusion models can do. And one of the things that I find really, really interesting about this paper is that they didn't just introduce a new model architecture. They actually went deep into the challenges of training these models, specifically that gradient variance issue that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly, yeah. And that focus on those fundamentals, those noise scheduling techniques that they developed to mitigate that variance that could have broader implications for training other types of diffusion models as well.
Absolutely, and the fact that they were able to achieve state-of-the-art perplexity among diffusion models, and demonstrate such strong zero-shot capabilities, that really suggests that these models have a really robust and comprehensive understanding of language.
Yeah, definitely. And that ability to generate variable length sequences, that's addressing a really critical need for a lot of real world applications, things like dialogue systems and creative writing tools.
So really what we're seeing here is this kind of convergence of ideas, right? They're taking the best of different modeling paradigms, the training efficiency and high quality of autoregressive models, the potential parallelism and controllability of diffusion models. And they're combining them in a way that really gives us a more versatile and powerful toolkit for tackling these complex language generation tasks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is really just the beginning. We're going to see a lot more work in this direction, exploring different ways to combine and blend these different modeling approaches.
So for you, our listeners, the question is how might these advancements influence your own work? Could this block diffusion approach be beneficial for the specific challenges that you're facing? Maybe you're working on a dialogue system or a a text summarization system, or any other application where you need to generate high quality text efficiently and flexibly.
And if you're interested in diving deeper into the details of this paper, I highly recommend checking out sections 4 and 5, which really delve into the understanding and mitigation of that gradient variance issue that we talked about, and section 6, which provides a really comprehensive overview of the experimental results.
Yeah, there's a lot to dig into there. And finally, I think it's worth thinking about, given the success of this approach, interpolating between autoregressive and diffusion models, what other hybrid approaches might be out there? What other ways can we combine the strengths of different modeling paradigms to achieve even greater breakthroughs in generative AI?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about the architectures. It's also about the training objectives, the inference strategies. All of those things can be combined in new and interesting ways.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a really fascinating paper to discuss, and I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more work in this area in the near future.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Until next time.